I think what's great about painting and photography is that you can look at an image and it has to evoke something. It has to suggest something. It has to take you places. Film works in very different ways. I think the power of film and of a great image in cinema is that it is the culmination of story. The final image of Vertigo, which I think is probably the greatest final shot for me in the history of cinema. If you just look at that frame and you don't know what the story's about, it's a great shot, but it becomes extraordinarily heartbreaking if you understand and know the story that led to it. And I think as a visual medium, only cinema can do that. I remember very distinctly was actually Empire Strikes Back. And I was raised in Geneva, Switzerland, and it's one of those film moments where I distinctly remember being in the theater. I remember where I was. I remember the seat. I remember that my mother was sitting next to me. And of course the I'm your father moment, which we all remember. But you know, especially when you're a kid, I stood up in the theater. It's just one of those moments where you go, wait a minute, what's going on here? You know, I don't understand. And then the movie ends, and you're still in shock, and then you know that you're going to have to wait 3 years, you know, for the next chapter, which at that point is, you know, basically half of my life as a kid. And so that experience, and then going home, and you know, of course, I had the Star Wars figures, and it sort of encourages you to play now, to be in that sandbox, in George Lucas's sandbox, day after day after day. What's so brilliant about that moment is that this is where you realize that movies really can become a part of your life in a way that is very tangible, where you've entered the movie. And there's no looking back. You know, I'm very much like a sponge. To me, there's nothing that's out of bounds in terms of inspiration. I'm a documentary filmmaker, and yet I don't watch a ton of documentaries. So my influences really come from other places. I'm a huge film buff, and really, yes, of course, I love genre cinema. Big fan of horror, a big fan of westerns. But, you know, I also love classic cinema. I love, you know, screwball romantic comedies. As a kid, I was watching a lot of Tex Avery cartoons. You know, this sort of warped sense of humor for some reason. And I think the pacing of Tex Avery cartoons, and I'm not suggesting that this is something that you can see necessarily in what I do, but I think the films that I make are very fast-paced. They tend to be fast-paced, so maybe that's something that I got from that. I'm not really sure. I'm a huge fan of Lynch. You know, and I go to museums a lot. You know, so you know, painting, photography, very, very influential to me. I just feel like, why limit yourself to certain influences when there's so much to draw from and so much to see. So my journey as a filmmaker has been pretty strange, to be honest. I was a huge, you know, film nerd as a kid. I mean, I was really passionate about cinema. In fact, at the age of 12, I had, believe it or not, a Hitchcock series that I did every Sunday with my parents and their friends, because of course my friends didn't care about that stuff. But I would show like a Hitchcock film on VHS. Every Sunday, and then we'd do a little intro and then a little Q&A afterwards, and then I also did a whole Spielberg series, you know. So I was really into that stuff, and I remember watching, you know, movies like Scanners or Night of the Living Dead on VHS, and stopping a lot and trying to understand how the shots were made. So I think the impulse was there. But then in my early teens, I discovered golf, and I wanted to be a golf professional. And when I graduated from high school, I became a golf professional. And then eventually I came back around by going back to college, taking some theater classes, writing plays, thinking I was going to be a playwright, going to the dramatic writing program at NYU, where I had to basically also write screenplays. And so at that point, I reconnected with my love of film and became truly a filmmaker out of frustration that my screenplays were getting optioned, but they were not getting produced. And at that point, I was like, I'm just going to make my own films. And so I very much have kept that spirit of independence, as an independent filmmaker, I think. And it's still pretty much the way that it is now. So obviously, when you make a film or when you tell a story, it has to be something that comes from within. It has to mean something. It is something that has to keep you up at night, and something that when you wake up in the morning, you have to be excited about it. So that said, I don't think I make films for myself. I think that's it's a lonely enough process. I do make films for audiences, and I believe in making films for audiences, specifically the kinds of films that I make being about cinema and about hopefully showing cinema in a way that people had not necessarily considered. To me, is extremely important, especially in this day and age where, I guess we call it the age of content. And I'm not opposed to content. And by content, I mean this idea that we can watch movies on the fly or parts of a movie on your phone, on your iPad, on the plane, and all of that. But we have to be very careful not to lose track of our cinematic heritage, of the masters of cinema, of which there are very few. I think every age has very, very few of them, and their process and what that means, and the collective experience of watching a film on the big screen with people around you. So, it's not what I set out to do, but I think because I remain true to my voice as a filmmaker and to what I believe in and to what I'm passionate about, over the course of what is becoming now a body of work, I'm starting to realize, okay, yeah, so that's what this is about, and it's still taking me to places that are very surprising. The film that I'm working on right now, The Exorcist, with William Friedkin, was a complete surprise. The fact that I met him the way that I did is very surprising and serendipitous. He would probably say, in fact, he told me it was fate. So, I'm sort of going along with it, and we'll see where my path as a filmmaker takes me, but I'm very excited now. Obviously, we've lost a great deal of our cinematic heritage. I think we're talking roughly 50% prior to 1950, 80%, prior to 1920. We're talking really alarming numbers. And ironically, now that we're in the digital age, you'd think, oh yeah, everything can be preserved, but then, Warner Media gets rid of Filmstruck, and suddenly now physical media becomes important again, So I think we need to redouble our efforts. And, there are, of course, a number of organizations out there that are dedicated to doing this, but there's not enough. There's not enough resources. And so the more entities there are out there, the more universities do their part. Obviously, IU is amazing. The collection that you have is just, it's jaw-dropping stuff, So it's wonderful, and it's very important that there are a number of programs, and hopefully there will be more and more and more, because this is not something that any entity can do alone. And the more those entities, communicate and help each other and support each other in our, I think, collective mission, which is, we're talking really now about our culture, and what makes me mad about, Warner Media getting rid of Filmstruck is that, first of all, it was a business that was making profit, maybe not a ton of profit by their standards, but it's still making profit. But more importantly, when you're in that position where you're the custodian of an entity or a platform that is culturally important, I think you have a responsibility. Obviously, Criterion take that responsibility very seriously, and they're wonderful. I feel very fortunate I get to work with them. But you know, I really feel like, especially those huge media conglomerates, and they can, you know, churn out all the content that they want, and that's fine. But I think they also have this responsibility to preserve the culture for which they are, in a way, they're responsible. It's theirs. It belongs to them. You know. How long did it take us, you know, as a culture to even come around to the idea that cinema is actually an art form, right? And by that point, we had already, of course, lost so much because those movies were just, right? I mean, you make so many prints, you send them to theaters. I mean, it's a product, and then you just discard them, you know? So we can't make that same mistake again. And as we all know, history tends to repeat itself. And now that there's so much content, so much stuff out there. But, you know, I think Martin Scorsese put it best at the TCM Film Festival last year. He had just a wonderful speech. And he said, you know, when you live in a culture where you can look at a Super Bowl ad or a reality TV series or Lawrence of Arabia, and they're all considered content, you know you've got a problem. And I think that really, you know, hits the nail on the head right there. So you know, while all of it is fine, and this is the new culture that we're in now, we have to also make the effort to say, okay, this movie is important. Let's make sure that we save it and preserve it and treat it the way that it needs to be treated. Well, it's very rare, first of all, I think, for universities to have a place like this. I mean, this place it's really special, and you know, just on a pure level of cinema, the quality of the picture and the quality of the sound, it's a wonderful theater, and I think every university out there should be lucky to be blessed with a place like this. But you know, this is the gold standard, right? So to be exposed to this, and also the kind of programming that you do. I mean, I was just leafing through your program. It makes me I want to be here every day, you know, and it's such engaging, wonderful programming. And I think that I really hope that your students here really take full advantage of this. If I were a student here, I would be coming. I mean, every screening, no question about it. In fact, that's what I did at NYU. I was at the dramatic writing program, and I crashed the cinema studies courses, and I would go and watch movies with them and hear their commentary. And that's how, you know, I think that's how I learned. I learned just as much crashing those courses than I did actually taking my classes in dramatic writing. So yeah, I think it's extraordinarily important. And it makes me very happy every time that I see a place like this that it exists.